we on? Good. Welcome to the Better Than Not podcast. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But when we at least do something, we know it's almost always better than not.
Hi there, and welcome to Better Than Not, the podcast that aims to capture shifting perspectives and thought-provoking ideas in conversation, based loosely on my series, A Changing Frame of Reference, which you can read on the Substack app. I hope you will, as it might give you some insight into what the podcast is all about. I'm your host, Doug Gardam, and today it's a pleasure to welcome Scott Wheeler. Scott, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm in the thick of my summer season here. I've got a big hockey tournament coming up in a couple of weeks, and then another big hockey tournament about a week after that, and we'll be right back into cold rinks for the next 8 or 9 months here shortly after a brief time off.
Well, I appreciate having some time to talk today. Scott is, if you haven't kind of figured it out yet, which you may not have, is a sports writer for The Athletic. He's also written a book called On the Clock, which is about the behind the scenes of Toronto Maple Leafs and the NHL draft, which I'm really anxious to get into. But as it turns out, we're also both Carleton graduates, which I think this is the first time I've interviewed a Carleton graduate since we started. And different things. So, Scott, it's to kind of get started before we get too far into anything. How did you land in the world of sports writing?
Oh, that's a very, very, very good question. It was always a passion of mine to go all the way back. It was a passion of mine early in high school. I wasn't one of those kids who waffled into grade 11 and 12 about what I wanted to do or had to wonder and apply for different types of programs for university and that kind of a thing. I started writing for my local newspaper in Aurora, which is where I'm sort of born and raised when I was a teenager. Covering local sports stories and pitching local sports stories. I then did the same up in cottage country, about 2 hours north of here, where my parents have a place and where they now have moved to. They're no longer in Aurora, up in Haliburton and Minden, and sort of the Kawarthas here, and wrote all sorts of sports stories for the local papers up there, and really developed a passion as far back as high school in reporting and storytelling and writing, and it was always obviously a strength of mine in school all the way up and that kind of a thing. But knew quickly, and then once you know quickly, there are really only two major programs in Canada for journalism, or at least in Ontario for journalism, and those are Ryerson, now Toronto Metropolitan University, and Carleton. And so I applied to both. Was accepted into both. At the time, you used to have samples of your work and a bit of a portfolio to get into Ryerson. Carleton was just based off of grades. And then did a 4-year undergraduate degree in journalism with a minor in law at Carleton. Graduated from Carleton and got very, very lucky. I did internships at the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Sun and Post Media, and I worked 2 years in communications and public relations for the PGA Tour and in the golf world, writing for PGAtour.com as a university student and that kind of a thing, and then got sort of my dream job directly out of school after an internship the summer after I graduated at the Toronto Star covering news. So you name it. Anything I got assigned to at the time, the legalization of marijuana, the ongoing housing crisis in the country. I wrote about giant inflatable ducks on Lake Ontario and you name it, crime and courthouse drama and all of that. So got very lucky coming out of that and sort of landed my dream job at The Athletic, which was to cover the Toronto Maple Leafs, and did that for a few years, traveling with the Leafs, reporting on the Leafs. Sort of covered the Leafs beat, if you will, for a few years. And then about 5-6 years ago, made the full-time switch from covering the Leafs to covering prospects nationally for The Athletic. So I cover the NHL draft, the World Juniors, the Under-18 Worlds, the Memorial Cup, the Frozen Four, all of the big sort of tournaments and the players below the NHL. So telling the stories of the kids before they arrive into the league.
Wow. So that's a really, I was going to say, you said like a dream job, but I mean, you walked you came in with enormous experience starting in high school, writing for like the local newspaper. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, it's just something that started pretty organically. Part of it was just the classic kid who's obsessed with sports and wants to work in sports. And how do you work in sports? Well, you become a coach or an agent. And I thought about going that way.
oh,
Part of
really?
the reason I part of the reason I minored in law at Carleton was that if the journalism world, which as we all know, and not
Oh,
just in this country, but
everywhere.
everywhere these days is struggling, especially on the newspaper and the print side. I sort of told myself if it doesn't work out, I'll go on to I'll go to law school and I'll try to sort of navigate whether it's through the agency side and becoming a player agent or just going into some kind of a legal field that's sports related. That was kind of the plan, but really wanted to give journalism a go. And I think the only way to truly do that in today's day and age is to grind
Oh,
and to get bylines and to learn how to tell stories and how to interview people and how to get to know people and research and all of that. So
oh,
tried to get it at a pretty early age. I was always a good student and that kind of a thing. So always knew that I would do well in university and that kind of a thing. But really, just it was a passion for sports and a passion for writing, and I tried to marry the two.
wow. No, I was gonna say that you obviously had it's kind of neat that you get a gift like that and you're able to chase it down. Like you're able to kind of just focus right on it. Because it's like obviously you are and your experience would be almost second to none for probably even your age, right? Like as far as what you've been able to cover. So
Yeah, and Carleton journalism, the journalism school at Carleton is obviously prestigious, so that helps.
yes.
But part of what happens at Carleton is they start the program with 200 students in first year, and by the end of it, there's typically only about 70 or 80 that graduate, and you have to meet certain grade checkpoints each year in order to stay in the program. Otherwise, you end up people often switch into communications or marketing or something in that field. And I got to be honest, because of the way the industry's going, from my graduating class, I don't know what my graduating class number is, but I would imagine it was 70 or 80 students of that initial 200. And I think there are maybe 10 or 15 of us that are actually still, what is this, 8, 9 years later, still doing
Yeah.
journalism, like capital J journalism. There are people who are at the CBC and
Yep.
people up in the north writing for newspapers in the Arctic and that kind of a thing. And but it's a pretty small group. You got to love it. You got to be okay with not making huge money.
Yeah.
So it's got to be something that you care about, and I think that's the primary driver for a lot of journalists.
Well, obviously it's a big heart thing for you. Like it's deep in your heart, not only in your brain. It was funny when you mentioned about Carlton because I was the engineering program, and I remember first day, very similar. They said, "Look to your left and look to your right. Only one of you'll be here at Christmas time." And it was like, wow, that's intimidating. So that's kind of a cool thing you got to do, and like you say, it's a very prestigious school from that standpoint. What got you? So you're going through. You've done like any one of your internships would have been a star thing to get as a role, rather Globe and Mail, the Star, and then you're in the Star. You're hired by the Star. You're covering these crazy things with regards to sports. Well, before I go there, what got you started with the hockey? Like you went on the PGA tour, you said. So you're like the golf part, but is it
Yeah.
just sports or is it particular sports that like just make you work, make you tick?
I mean, I'm a huge golf fan. I covered a bit of the Raptors and the Blue Jays when I was at the Toronto Sun with their massive sports section that they really prioritize at the
Oh,
Sun,
wow.
obviously. I just love sports, but hockey was always sort of number one. It's the sport I grew up playing.
Okay.
I never missed a Leafs game growing up. My parents would tell you that I was an encyclopedia in terms of stats and
Ah,
that
there you
side
go.
of it. And just always from a very early age was just obsessive about the NHL and about hockey and about the Leafs. And I started a blog before I got into reporting. I started a
Wow.
blog online and developed a little bit of a following on Twitter early years of Twitter just from blogging about the Leafs, and it was just something that it was fun to me. It never felt like a job. That blog in my early years at Carleton was paying for my beer money and my food money, and that was the kind of money that I was making off of it. So it was a very, very small operation, and it wasn't a job, but it was something that I had just I wanted to do, and was lucky that I could dedicate time to it and still sort of figure out the schooling side of it. And just one thing led to another. My job at the Athletic was I was actually home on my Christmas break for what was called the Centennial Classic, which was in my fourth year of university. The Leafs and the Red Wings played an outdoor game at BMO Field in Toronto. And I decided to apply for credentials with my blog at the time, and I got approved for media credentials to cover it. And at the time, just happened to be sitting next to James Myrtle, who had about a month or two earlier had left the Globe and Mail, where he was a longtime Leafs reporter. Had left the Globe and Mail to start this new outfit called The Athletic, and 9 years later, The Athletic has 500 reporters covering sports all over the world, and all across North America. We've got an entire newsroom in England covering the Premier League, and it's just become a monster. And at the time, Myrtle just needed help on the editing desk. They had 3 shifts a week: Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday nights. They didn't have an editor on their desk to take in copy from the Jays games and the Raptors games and the Leafs games. And Myrtle just turned to me in the press box and said, "Hey, I know you're still finishing up school and you're in 4th year." And we'd known each other from around the rink a little bit. And he just said, "If you're interested in getting paid minimum wage to edit 3 nights a week from 6 p.m. to midnight on our desk, you can pitch me stories on the side, and if it works out and your stories do well, maybe we'll hire you." And from January, when he hired me to do 3 nights a week making $15 an hour, to when I graduated in May, I probably pitched a dozen stories, but I was primarily supposed to just be editing. And those stories did well enough that when I graduated, they offered me a full-time job. So that was literally just luck of the draw. If I'd been assigned a different seat in the press box, we never would have had that conversation, and I would have gone back to school, and I wouldn't be here, right?
I love that story, Scott, because it's one of those that you hear every once. I have this story that I read. I don't know whether you've read the Elton John book, but he talks about the freak part of how he met Bernie Taupin. In fact, he met his lyrics, and it was given to him after he failed an audition for an orchestra for a live show. And somebody came up and gave him a manila envelope with lyrics in it. And that's what, because he found he could put music to them, obviously, and that changed their world. And I'm kind of going like, you've had one of those events too. Like, how crazy is that?
Yeah, it's one little thing leads to another, right? And it's just about, it's very cliche, and hockey players use it all the time, but it's one foot in front of the other, right? You just gotta keep figuring things out and keep following leads. And it's very much what journalists do, is follow leads. So it's a happy coincidence, I suppose.
Oh, no, very, very cool. So, Scott, do you remember, like, you played hockey, lots of stats, you knew the players and all that in your youth. Do you remember the first time you met, like, one of your hockey heroes in this role of yours? Because, like, you're around them all the time now, but it's like, that must have been the first time when you had to go and report on, this is. Do you remember that?
Yeah, the first real event that I was ever credentialed for, I had my blog and I applied. It was an NHLPA event, so they were doing some kind of a charity game in Toronto during the off season, and I applied for credentials and was surprised when they said yes, kind of thing. It was at the Mattamy Athletic Center, which is formerly Maple Leaf Gardens. They've turned Maple Leaf Gardens into a grocery store and a rink for Ryerson, or for TMU now. And I applied and I got credentials. I must have been 14, 15 years old. And this was credentialed with reporters from maybe 16, but I was in my early years of high school. And this was with like the reporters from TSN and Sportsnet and all of the newspapers and that kind of a thing, and just showed up with my laptop and a microphone, and I forget all of the players that were there, but it was the local guys plus a bunch of the Leafs. So it was Dion Phaneuf, who was the captain of the Leafs at the time, and Steven Stamkos was participating, and that was a big deal for me. I'd done stories on local Olympians for the local paper at that point, and had interviewed some cool people and that kind of thing, but I'd never really been in a big TV scrum like you see on TV, right? So that was sort of the first introduction, and I remember wearing a nice outfit and getting dressed up for it and trying to act professional and introducing myself to all the reporters and that kind of a thing. And that was almost 20 years ago now. So it's
wow.
That would have been, I think that was the first real event where it was like, okay, I'm doing this. I gotta figure this out.
Do you remember like meeting any particular athletic personality that really like affected you? Like in a way,
There's been tons. Yeah, there's been tons. I've developed some really really good relationships with different players over the years that I cherish. There are coaches
cool.
and general managers from around hockey that I've got really good relationships with. People who I interviewed for my book that I've kept in touch with. So that's always special. People that move from sort of sources to friendships or something close to a friendship. There are people I've got a lot of time for. Like if I ran into Zach Hyman, for example, who plays for the Edmonton Oilers now and was with the Toronto Maple Leafs when I was covering the Leafs for a few years. I know Zach's brother really well now, and he's the general manager of the Brantford Bulldogs in the OHL now. And I know the Hyman family really well, and those are people who I just have a lot of time for, a lot of respect for. I think they're just good, genuine people. They always treated me very well. I kind of came up with Hyman as well. He was with the Toronto Marlies before he was with the Leafs, and I was covering the Toronto Marlies in my early years. So people like that. There's been young players that have come through that I've told very human stories on that I feel I have a connection to. I did a story with Marco Rossi, who's a center now for the Minnesota Wild in the NHL, but played for the Ottawa 67s in the OHL and was a top 10 pick into the NHL. And he's an Austrian who came over from Austria and played in the OHL, of course. And one of my favorite sort of pieces of journalism, types of journalism that I like to do is what I would call embed journalism, where I do something with the subject. I embed with the subject. Instead of sticking a microphone in front of their face, I sort of live what they live. So I've done that a bunch of times over the years. I've gone behind the scenes with a minor pro team in the ECHL that was one of my most cherished stories I've ever written about. The Brampton Beast. Spent a whole season with the Brampton Beast, skated with them in practices, went on the bus with them for road trips, hung out around the room with them, really tried to tell their story over the course of a season. But one of them I also did with Marco Rossi, where I moved in with his billet family for a week in Ottawa and sort of lived with his billet family and wrote a story about this kid from Austria who traveled across the world to sort of move in with a billet family. I did another one on Yu Sato, a Japanese kid who came over and played in the QMJHL for the Quebec Remparts. I sort of went and lived with him, this Japanese kid who for the first time was living in North America, and sort of told his hockey story. And there's a long list of stories like that. Those are the stories that I always sort of hold dear once you're in it with someone and you really get to know them, and it's not just a sort of formal interview process. Those are the connections that you form. And there have been cool people that I've met over the years. Obviously on the golf side, I don't know them, but I brushed elbows with Rory McIlroy at the Canadian Open and those types of people, which is always obviously still cool. You still sort of pinch yourself on stuff like that. And covering the Jays during their heyday with Jose Bautista and the Raptors when they were losing every year to LeBron James. I covered one of their playoff series against the Cleveland Cavaliers when LeBron was really sort of at his height. So those are really cool. And I've got colleagues who could tell you, I've got colleagues who've been doing it for 50 years and have covered Olympic games and that kind of thing. And they've got stories for for a lifetime to share. I'm not quite there, but still feel very blessed to have witnessed some of the moments that I've witnessed, and
Oh,
especially
yeah.
at the World Juniors. I've been in the building for some of the iconic World Juniors moments that we'll
Oh,
be reliving on TSN for the rest of our lives, kind of thing. And was there for Bedard's hat trick, for example, against Slovakia. Connor Bedard's hat trick against Slovakia
mm,
in Halifax a few years ago, and Mason McTavish batting the puck off the goal line in Edmonton at the Summer World Juniors coming out of the pandemic in overtime a couple of years ago, and some really, really cool moments that I've been in the building for. So you carry that with you for sure.
oh yeah. When you're around this, I'll say this, almost it's gifted talent, but it's not just about gifts. It's about hard work. It's about
Mm-hmm.
psychology. Like, what stands out in dealing, like, it's kind of cool you've been through the golf world as well as the hockey world. What stands out, like, to you that you see in some of these incredible athletes, like, to be able to do what they do? Like, it's like, because I mean, we all get to be 8 years old or 10 years old. We play pee-wee
Mm-hmm.
hockey, and we're gonna go to the top. And it's like, there's so few, right, that actually kind of
Yeah.
get there. And I said for years now, like, being a professional athlete is a 24/7 role all year long now.
Yes, that's it for me. That's what you quickly learn about all of them, and I get that sort of inside look at the kids in particular, the 16, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old hockey players before they get into the NHL. I That's my world, and even in that world you realize at a very early age that it is a singular focus and determination. It's every second of every day. It's watching what you eat, how you sleep, uh, no phones before bedtime, like that, all of the things that you hear about that these kids do, skating treadmills now on the hockey side. And I think frankly it's gotten a little out of hand on the hockey side in terms of the cost of getting to the NHL, the
Yeah.
cost of playing high level hockey and staying at high level hockey. Nowadays, if you're not on a skating treadmill in the summer, if you're not skating with a dedicated skills coach and skating coach and working with a strength and conditioning coach at an early age, it is virtually impossible to make it to the very highest levels of the
Wow.
sport. And it's that way in most sports now. Obviously, soccer and basketball are global sports in very unique ways and are still in many ways cost effective. But the other sports we cover at the Athletic, I talk to reporters from across our company all the time, and you hear all the same stories, whether it's the extreme costs of tennis or F1 or
Oh,
golf or even the costs of hockey. It's a whole family thing as well. I think that's what you realize at a very early age.
oh,
All of these
okay.
players, all
Interesting.
of these players talk about their parents, but it's not in a cliche way. The sacrifices of parents to get kids to where they get to. Uh, that's where a lot of the human is in the story for me. For each of these
Ah,
kids, it's in the sacrifices that others make for them, the network of people who support them, and then even after that, even after doing it every day since you were 5 years old and not stopping summertime, there's no such thing as an off season in any of these sports anymore. It's
yeah, yeah.
truly
Oh,
every single day. And many of them don't love it. They do it because they're good at it.
ah,
Obviously there are people who have it's their passion, it's their in their DNA, but there are a lot of kids and hockey players and NHL players who don't love spending their days at the rink every day and that lifestyle. And there's
interesting.
players who once they're retired will never put on a pair of skates, will never skate again, will never they want nothing to do with it when they're done. And I think that's because for so long, for 30, 40 years in many cases, it is every single day and every waking minute. And they are just so focused on winning and on getting better and on climbing the mountaintop. And it just sort of never really ends for them. I mean, we see it even in the NHL with guys like Sidney Crosby, who've won 3 Stanley Cups. It just never ends. He's wired that way.
Yes.
There's no let up. There's no patting himself on the back. There's no break. It's just right back at it. Let's do it. Let's do it all over again until normally the body gives out, right?
Yeah.
That's where
Yeah.
it normally ends.
And you probably find out where like all our bodies are different. So like you may find that you don't even have the body to actually get to that level, even though you have the enthusiasm and the drive, right?
Yeah, and sometimes it's genetic. Sometimes guys struggle with weight. The kids, I see it in kids all the time. They struggle with weight at both ends of the spectrum. There are kids who can't keep can't keep weight off and play too heavy, and they're just their metabolism doesn't help them. And then there are kids whose metabolism works against them, and they can't, no matter how many calories they pump into them, no matter how much they eat, no matter how much pasta and chicken and bread and on and on and on, they just can't add weight, and they stay skinny, or they don't get the growth spurt that they need, and they're 5'8" instead of 5'11", or 5'11" instead of 6'3", and their game doesn't translate right to the size of player that they are. And so much of it comes down to that. It comes down to not just getting in the gym and getting results in the gym, but just growing and getting the games at in every sport. The game is getting taller. We're seeing it in the NBA, where you can't
Oh,
even be 6'2" or 6'3" anymore. But we're also seeing it in the NHL. I just covered the 2025 NHL draft in Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago, and it was the first draft in NHL history where no defensemen under 6 feet tall were selected. Right, so it's
wow.
happening in the sport, and it's becoming a bigger, stronger, faster game every year, and it's going to be that way for the next 100 years. And eventually, it's a lot of it's going to come down to genetics, because the athletes today are just freaks.
No, it's interesting. Like, I really like how you brought out the fact your description, Scott, is amazing to me. It's just how you've painted a real picture of professional sport, but the support of those around and it being recognized, like parental and families, what it takes to do that. But I also thought your comment was interesting, is they don't all love it. It's like, that's one of the things you just kind of picture. And
Yeah, and a lot of
and
them don't like watching hockey either. A lot of the
really,
kids have spent so much time playing AAA hockey, and then junior hockey, and then college hockey, and then pro hockey, that they've never actually they get to the NHL, and they've never actually watched a ton of it. They aren't the kids that are going to Leafs games with their families growing up. They just don't have
interesting.
that time and that
Right.
interest. And I talk to kids all the now. There are kids who are like that and are fans of the game, but there are tons and tons of, you'd be shocked at how many players in the NHL growing up didn't actually watch much NHL hockey like the rest of us, right? So
That's
that's a big part of it. There's just so much of it in their life that they have to find outlets. When they get home from the rink at 7 or 8 p.m. after they've just gone to school, they don't want to turn on the TV and watch the Leafs game. They'd rather play video games with their buddies or watch a movie or whatever.
interesting.
It's just not, it's not in them in a lot of cases.
Do you know what makes your story very interesting here too, Scott, is the fact that you've done kind of similar in the writing world. You've done like you hit the draft choice, you got your intern, and now you're playing and like in the pro level of, I'll call it the what journalists go to school for in many ways, right? Or writers. You started with
Mm-hmm.
saying you've got the dream job. You're playing with the big guys, right? That's very cool. You can
Yeah,
probably
yeah. I've never thought about it that way, but there is a little bit of that. There's a similar climb. You have to be, as I
oh
talked about
yeah,
off the top, you have to be obsessive about it to sort of carve out a niche and carve out a voice and carve out a following for your work. I'm also in an industry where there are a lot of people who do it as a hobby too. So
yes,
there's the professional level in terms of people who are paid to do it for a living and their families rely on that paycheck. And there's the pressures that come with working at a major newspaper or a place like The Athletic. But there's also this huge cottage industry
mm,
of people who do it as a passion and who write blogs. And
yeah.
that's where I started as well. So I always try to give back to those people. And I was on the phone today with a Carleton grad who
Oh,
has just
cool.
gotten a job covering the Sioux Greyhounds at the Sioux Star, and has got his first job coming out of Carleton J School. And his professor, Ian Mendez, who used to cover the Ottawa Senators for us at The Athletic and is a friend of mine, sort of connected the two of us because he knew that he was about to enter into covering junior hockey. And So you're always trying to pay it forward, and there's
Sure.
a healthy level of competition in my world as well. I've never really thought about it the way that you just framed it, though. That's
No,
interesting.
to me, your story is very, very similar, going through the ranks to get to where you're going, and then like the breaks you get too that kind of come about, right? It's
Yep,
very
big
interesting.
time.
So,
And for players, they need those breaks too. People forget about that. If you're Sidney Crosby or Wayne Gretzky or Connor McDavid or LeBron James, that's different. But for most of the players, even at the pinnacle, even at the 1% or the
yeah.
0.01% that make it to the professional level, they needed a coach who gave them an opportunity at the right
Mhm.
time. They were at some point in their life on a roster where there were better players than them, and they had to earn the trust of a coach or climb through a level where they weren't the best player. Someone had to get an injury for them to get their first NHL game,
Yeah.
or someone had to have their wife was having a baby and they got called up to fill in for a couple of games while a player was away from the team. That's how a lot of this happens for these players.
Yeah.
It's a series of, it's hard work for sure, but it's a series of moments along the way as well.
It's not all in our control, so to speak, right? The So getting to you talked a little bit of just being in the recent 2025 draft, crazy exciting. How did your book come about? Like, how did that, like, did it just kind of like, this is an obvious thing to write about, or was it something that you just got intrigued by to say, let's on the clock, let's take a look behind the background? Because it's fascinating for many people to know. I'll say I read Scott Young when I was a kid and playing hockey, and I didn't learn that he was Neil Young's dad for many years, but the way he wrote about like the tryouts and the like playing in the dressing room, it was like that was almost as
Mhm.
fascinating as the game for me. So doing
Yeah.
behind the scenes on the draft, I mean, like that's got to be something else.
Yes, I wish I could take credit for the idea.
Oh,
Typically, when you write a book, you come up with the idea, you find an agent, or you go without an agent and you pitch directly to a publisher, and they offer you an advance or they decline or whatever. In this case, Triumph Books actually reached out. They had an idea to do kind of a series of books on sort of going behind the scenes of the history
ah,
of the NHL draft with different teams. And one of the first ones that they wanted to do was Toronto, because Toronto's a big market, and they, before they tested out the similar style of book on different markets, they wanted to test it out in Toronto, and they reached out to me because they knew I'd covered the Leafs and that the NHL draft was kind of my thing. Originally, when they reached out, their idea was more a history of the Toronto Maple Leafs at the NHL draft. I didn't want to go that way. The draft has been happening. The draft has existed since the 60s, despite the NHL existing much longer. And I didn't want to go through 50, 60 something years of history and every pick and that
oh,
kind of a thing. I didn't
oh,
want it to be an encyclopedia on the draft. And so the counter pitch that I went back to them with was, typically a book has 20 chapters, 25 chapters. What about 20 sort of behind the scenes stories from over the years? And I'll go
oh,
back to the first draft and I'll finish at a recent draft, but I'm not going to hit every single draft or every single big pick in between. I'm going to pick some interest. I'm going to tell the stories of the big picks and sort of find some interesting stories that have never been told, which is hard to do in a market like Toronto where every story has been told 100 times.
yeah.
But that was the goal, was sort of talk to general managers, former scouts, former agents, former players, and sort of the stories of how they were picked, or of their big day getting drafted,
Oh
or
man.
how getting drafted sort of one thing led to another. And so that's what it became. The book is about 20 chapters and 20 stories on different draft moments and different picks, and picks that weren't made, and the debates that the scouts had at the draft table, and speaking with all of the former general managers and that kind of a thing. But it was a fascinating process. It was the hardest work thing I've ever had to do.
Oh really?
Typically, when people write a book on that scale, they're doing it. They take a sabbatical from work, and
Ah,
they do it.
okay.
They take a year off and they dedicate their time to the book. Mine was a little bit different because it was my first book, and the advance money that I was going to be paid for it wasn't enough for a living
Yeah,
wage.
right.
I had to balance working at the Athletic and writing a 70, 80,000 page, 80,000 word book. And I was also doing it while we were new homeowners at the time, and we were having our first. My wife was pregnant with our first kid at the
Oh
time,
man. Yeah.
and
The
so it was just
realities.
a very very busy time in my life. And honestly, if I were going to do it again, I wouldn't do it that way. It was too much. I would do my 9 to 5 work at the Athletic when I wasn't traveling for my job, which I do a lot of,
Right.
and I'd do my 9 to 5 job. I'd put my laptop away. I'd have dinner with my wife, and then as soon as dinner was over, every night for a year from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m., I was trying to make phone calls and write the book. And on weekends, I was writing the book, and it was just it was a grind for a solid year. It's a 2-year process. It's normally a year to write. The deadline with most publishers is normally a year to write and a year to edit. So I had to help out and edit and do all that in the second phase. But that stuff's the second part is a lot less laborious, if you will. The actual interviews and the reporting and the way I wanted to do it, which was to interview a ton of people and transcribe all the interviews and then piece together these sort of behind the scenes stories. That part of it in and of itself was just a ton of work of transcribing interviews and that kind of a thing. There's AI that does that now, but I find it's pretty poor. And so I like to transcribe every word of every interview I do. So it was a grind. I hope to write another book someday, but I hope when I do it that it will be my sole focus, if you will.
Was there anything in writing this book that like really stuck out to you that like I did not know that, and that's kind of an incredible story? Or like, not to do any spoiler alerts, Scott, just like, was there kind of, when you go through something like that, sometimes there's something that just bowls you right over? Did you have an event like that, or maybe not?
Really, just the eye-opening piece of it was really just how much it has changed
Oh,
over the years.
really?
When Walt McKechnie, the first ever Maple Leafs draft pick, was selected, he didn't even know until days later that he'd been picked, because word traveled slowly, and he didn't even know what the NHL draft was or that he was being scouted for it at the time. There was no OHL, there was no World Juniors to showcase these players. These kids were playing in leagues scattered across Canada and the United States. There weren't, frankly, at the time, many players playing in Canada and the United States. And then you get into the era of Russians and defections, and I tell the story of Peter Inakchek, who, if you'll remember, was one of the first players to leave the former
Russia.
Soviet bloc
Yes.
and defect, and drugged himself and his girlfriend in the back of a car to put themselves to sleep so that they could get shoved into a trunk and driven into Austria, and met up with Leafs brass in Finland, and flew over to Toronto and didn't speak a word of English. And so there are stories like that, and then you fast forward to today, and the NHL draft is a machine. There are dozens of scouts that work for NHL organizations full-time scouting players. There are scouting services that provide video for every major level of hockey that's being played anywhere in the world. There are data and analytics people that study strictly the numbers. It's become a huge industry, scouting these players, and yet still most kids who get picked never play in the NHL. And so you're dedicating all this money into the hope that you'll get 1 or 2 good players from a draft of 7 rounds, right? So that part of it was fascinating. It's not ancient history. It's not that long ago that the Leafs scouts would drive to Belleville and they'd drive to Peterborough, and they would watch the same players over and over again, and they'd pick a player from Peterborough and they'd pick a player from Belleville, and that was it. I had Leaf scouts who told me they didn't even know who Teemu Selanne was, and they didn't watch Mike Modano because Punch Imlach and the Brass didn't give them money to travel to the United States, and the Canadian dollar was in the hole. And there was a time when the Toronto Maple Leafs weren't watching kids play in the United States or in Finland or in Sweden. Now the Toronto Maple Leafs spend millions of dollars a year to travel the world scouting players who they'll never draft, right? So just the history of the draft is fascinating to me in that way, because it's really not that long ago that Mike Modano and Teemu Selanne were coming into the league, and instead
Yeah.
of going to watch those kids play and picking those kids, the Leafs were getting drunk in a bar in Belleville talking about whoever they just watched in Belleville that night, right? Like those were
That
the
was the way.
stories that I kept hearing over and over again. So it's crazy how quickly in such a short period of time just money and the resources have poured into professional sports.
That is like actually stunning when you say that, because you said 60s, so that's like 60 years ago, right? That they didn't eat, like, Walt McCartney didn't even know he was.
And not even that. In the 80s and 90s, the Leafs were broke. Like they had no money and
Really?
they were struggling financially. Every team in Canada was at the time, and we almost lost we obviously lost the Winnipeg Jets, but
Yes.
we almost lost the Calgary Flames and the Edmonton Oilers at one point in time too, as well, right? So. And the Leafs famously had a number of consecutive very cheap businessmen who owned the team, and
Yes.
that was a big reason for why they haven't won a Stanley Cup since 1967, right? Although with all the money in the world now, they're still not doing it, of course, as well. So it's the Leafs of even 20, forget 60 years ago, the NHL of 20 or 25 or 30 years ago is almost unrecognizable to what the NHL is today.
That's amazing. I sometimes wonder, like, it's interesting, somebody who's had the exposure that you do, like, to play in Toronto as an example, because it's probably one of the, I live out west now, so of course I hear a lot more about the Canucks and the Oilers in Calgary, but like it's a like up there prestige organization to be part of. And I sometimes wonder, like, is the pressure
Yep.
as a human being, like, just as, like, because they're still human beings despite being gifted, just beyond in Toronto? Like, it's sometimes wonder, like, it's just amazing to me that we go so far sometimes and then again. Could you
Yeah,
comment on
no,
that?
it's
Like, or is that the
it's
same everywhere?
no, it's intense. It's intense, and it's not for everybody. And there's a reason that not just the Leafs, but that Canadian markets struggle now to
Ah,
attract the marquee free agents, and certainly American players have less interest in playing up here than they do in American markets, but
right.
increasingly Canadian players want to play not just in smaller markets where the microscope isn't quite as intense, but they want to play in warmer climates. And the tax
Oh
schemes
yeah,
in
the
different
tax.
cities has become a big thing. Obviously, the Florida Panthers and the Tampa Bay Lightning and the Dallas Stars play in
Oh, wow.
tax-free states. The Los Angeles Kings obviously don't in California. So, and obviously taxes are what they are in Ontario. And NHL players care about their money, even though they're making a ton of it these days. And they want to play in warm climates. And there's a lot working against Canadian teams.
Yeah.
The Leafs obviously have the benefit of their sales pitch is if you win here, you're a god forever. And even
Okay.
if you don't win here, if you become a fan favorite here, there's a lifetime of money to be made in endorsements and in being a beloved Toronto Maple Leafs. We're still seeing it with Ty Domi and
Yeah.
Darcy Tucker and Daryl Sittler and all of these alumni who have advertisements on TV and
Mhm.
sponsorships in and around, and restaurants and that kind of a thing in and around Toronto. And they're celebrities in Toronto. And none of those players, not Sittler, not Gilmore, not Domi, not Tucker, they never won a thing in this city, right? So
Yeah.
that's the pitch, but it's not for everyone. And there's a reason that Mitch Marner just a couple of
Yes.
weeks ago, as we're recording this, has made the decision to leave Toronto and to sign with the Vegas Golden Knights, because he was just tired of being part of it. Is that he was just tired of being the whipping boy, and he wanted a fresh start. He's got a young family, and he wanted a fresh start in a smaller media market. So there's a lot about Toronto that works against Toronto. And in saying that, I know, having been from here, born and raised here, winning here will be, for whoever does it someday, will be the greatest achievement of their professional life,
Oh,
and will be a moment in history. So I think there's a lot of players who are drawn to that. There's a lot of players who want to chase that glory as well, but it comes with scrutiny. It comes in today's online world with not just
Oh,
scrutiny for you, but messages to
oh,
your wife and your parents. And you'd be amazed at some of the crap that
yeah.
these guys
Okay.
deal with in terms of just the everything that's around being a Toronto Maple Leaf and the demands and the media demands and the public events and all of it, right? It's a big ask of guys who play in this city, and that hopefully for whoever does it someday and wins someday, the
Oh.
reward will be worth it, right?
Well, I mean, the Jays have gone on and won a couple of world championships, right? Since the Leafs '60s win. I mean, the Raptors have won, and I say like, yeah, but
Yep.
if the Leafs won, like they would just eclipse what those wins meant. Like
Oh,
it's hard to like,
it
and
would
that's
be
why,
biblical. Yeah.
yes, it's a great way of saying it. Because I think that in many ways, it just surpasses that. Is Toronto is the Maple Leafs when you think about like a sports franchise, so to speak. Um, but the other thing I've kind of found very interesting when I started to look into your book was the fact that how many different stories you were able to kind of capture. But you're after, like, it's a sports kind of book, but you're really after the heart. If in what I've kind of been able to read about, like that seems to be really important to you. Can you expand on that a little bit? Like it's like there's all the, like you said, as a kid you were statistics and all that detail, and yet the heart is really a big part of what you seem to be capturing, like going into families, going to like boarding with who the boarder is. How do you look at that, Scott? Did that develop for you in your storytelling?
Yeah, definitely. When I first started reporting, storytelling, blogging, however you want to frame it, I was very focused on the analysis of the games and the analysis of players and the analysis of what wins and how they can get better and the salary cap and trades and all of that, which is a huge part still of my
Yes.
job and of being a sports reporter. But the really good stuff for me, the stuff that has always sort of turned my crank, so to speak, is the human side of it, is ultimately storytelling. And storytelling has nothing to do with sports. Athletes are a vessel for it, and we can see struggle in them, and we can see these different things in them, these things that are in many cases admirable, in many cases the opposite. But
Yes.
that's what I'm after, is sort of where people come from, what makes them tick, how where they came from influenced where they ended up, the moments that have shaped them, the people that have shaped them. That's what I went into journalism school for, and I think that's also one of the things that I benefited from not having exclusively done sports. I think when you've only done
Ah,
sports writing, you can get bogged down in the transactions and that
yes.
side of it. I think my time, and it was brief. I only worked for 2 months at the Globe and Mail in my internship there, and 4 months at the Star. So we're really only talking about 6 months of reporting on things other than hockey. But those 6 months split between the Globe and the Star taught me a lot about the human side of
Ah,
why we do this, and whether you're sitting in a courtroom, or you're going to a crime scene, or you're speaking to someone who can't get into the housing market, or that really tells you sort of what it's all about, which
right.
is moving people. And not that you should be chasing the teary sob story. I think that's a very dangerous way to do your
Mm.
job. Ultimately it's about the truth, and I know there's all sorts of polarization right now about journalists and newspapers that have specific slants and specific political leanings, but ultimately I think most people who go into the industry do it for, not that you're patting yourself on the back, but they do it for righteous, noble intentions,
Mm.
right? They do
Yes.
it because they want to do some good in the world. And I think in many ways, the industry, especially in the United States with the political television now, and I think in many ways, reporting and news has gotten away from that. And that's why
Right.
there's so much distrust nowadays with with
Oh, yeah.
reporting and with news and with journalists. But there are still a lot of people who are doing it for the right reasons, which is to tell good stories, to inform the public. That's what it should be about.
No, I like how you said it, because I know we have a limited amount of time here, and I'm trying to watch the clock for you, because I was going to say I'm almost at the point where what you just said was very interesting to me. But two things. Where can people find you? Like, if they wanted from this episode of Better Than Not, where would they, like, they're all just going to find you at The Athletic. Do you have a blog still, or a website,
Yeah.
or?
No, unfortunately not. Part of my contract at The Athletic, and The Athletic was purchased by the New York Times. I don't know whether you're aware of that, but The Athletic was purchased by the New York Times a few years ago, and we now have very strict standards and rules on doing work outside of sort of a not that it is a non-compete clause, but there's sort of there are rules and regulations around doing work outside of The Athletic. So all of my writing and reporting is exclusively at The Athletic. I do the odd TV work and radio hits, or I'm doing radio hits constantly, almost every day these days. But the written work and my reporting and my writing is exclusively at The Athletic. But I'm very active on Twitter, or X as it's now called.
Okay.
So at Scott C. Wheeler on Twitter, or X is where you can find me, really.
A little bit of technical difficulties there with Scott Wheeler, but we're just wrapping up. And Scott, I can't thank you enough for participating. I'd love to have another chat with you someday, but this was wonderful. I much appreciate it. Anything else you'd like to wrap up with?
But I appreciate you having me on, and enjoyed the chat.
No, I would love to do it again. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you for joining us, and hope you'll join Better Than Not again in the future. Bye now.
Cheers.
Are we on? Good. Welcome to the Better Than Not podcast. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But when we at least do something, we know it's almost always better than not.